The Edible Estates project grew out of, I guess, a residency that I was doing in Australia for a month and a half. After I'd finished up these big projects in 2004, I went away with this idea that I would kind of think about where I wanted to go with my work. And this was immediately after the 2004 presidential elections of red state, blue state. So, of course, I had, coming out of that election, I had really strong feelings about the way it turned out, but even stronger feelings in general about this supposed division within our country. And I did feel, and I continue to feel that the contemporary world of architecture, design, and art that I'm a part of is incredibly insular and is focused in itself and is obsessed with this internal hermetic dialogue that really doesn't welcome people into it. And a lot of times you tend to feel like you're making work for yourself or for other people within your own discipline that really excludes a larger discourse with the world that we're living in today. And I just felt like after that election, like, I can't do that anymore. I'm not interested in continuing that sort of insular dialogue. Like, I want to make work. Well, after that election, I really felt that I wanted to make work for everyone that addressed the way we're really living today. So a broad, mainstream, populist sort of practice. And I don't know. I really had no idea where to begin with something like that. And I think my work was maybe already headed slightly in that direction, but that made me feel even more strongly about it. But the only thought I had when I came back from that trip was the desire to do something in the geographic center of the country as a symbolic act. So that was it. That's all I knew. It wasn't about gardens or lawns or food or anything like that. Though I had been quite obsessed with gardening previous to that, and I had spent a lot of time since moving to LA working in gardens, and specifically thinking a lot about productive food gardens. So Edible Estates grew out of that impulse to do something in the middle of the country, which then I had been doing, I think, a lecture in Kansas, and a curator there knew about this desire I had to do this thing in the center, and she was coincidentally curating a group show about food in Salina, Kansas, which is pretty much the geographic center of the country, which is also where this wonderful institution called the Land Institute happens to be located, which is doing a lot of research on how to grow food in a way that's more thoughtful to the location where it's being grown. So for example, in the prairie, you would grow a mixture of annuals and perennials. Anyway, so for some reason showing up in Salina, Kansas, I thought immediately about the front lawn and what a wasted potential that space seemed to be. And I don't know, I just had this immediate thought of what would happen if you grew food in your front lawn instead of grass. And that led to this idea of starting a serial project, a sequence of projects, of prototype gardens around the country, each one a model for its particular climate, its geography. Understanding that if you're going to grow a lawn, it's the same anywhere on the planet, but if you're going to grow food, suddenly it's hyper-local. It's different from city to city and home to home. So I felt like the only way you could really do the project justice was to do a whole series of them. Not only would each garden represent its particular region, but also that type of family, that type of house. Now I'm doing apartment buildings and a lot, hopefully as much diversity as possible within the series. The challenges on the gardens have been different for each one, which is kind of funny. I mean, the whole point of the project is to have as much diversity within the gardens as possible, and no challenge has been the same on each garden. Every time it's a totally different one. So in some cases it's funding, because typically the gardens are commissioned by art institutions, but sometimes I'll go ahead without that and cobble together some sort of support. Yeah, it's funny because the parts of the project that are really smooth and easy and the parts of them that are challenging really are totally different in each one. Sometimes it's hard to get enough help, whereas sometimes we have too much help. Like in the garden coming up next week in Austin, we have over 100 volunteers of people that have just randomly emailed saying, I want to help out in the garden. So it's going to be a challenge dealing with 100 volunteers over a weekend to make a garden. Sometimes it's the neighbors. In New Jersey, that garden, there was one neighbor on one side who hated it, and the neighbor on the other side who really loved it. Sometimes it's the family, you know, if they're a little nervous going into it and, you know, become really stressed out by the whole process. You know, even though once I've started the garden, I've already, you know, hopefully met with about 20 different families and selected a family who's most eager for the project and open to how much work it's going to be. I make the gardens, and then whatever happens is part of the story. It's not a particularly goal-oriented project beyond the making of the garden. Beyond that, I'm interested in what happens as a way of revealing in some way how we're living today. So I think if you were to evaluate the project as a purely political or environmental act, you could evaluate it pretty easily. The more people that would do it and the more successful those gardens are, you could evaluate the project as a success. But how do you evaluate as an art project, as a project that's commissioned by museums, that's shown in museums? How do you evaluate that? And I think it's an interesting thing that comes up with a lot of the work that I'm doing. How do you talk about it? How do you decide whether it's been successful or not? I think my ultimate goal with the projects is to, in some way, reveal the world that we're living in, the world that we've created for ourselves, and tell stories about that, and reveal things that may not have been evident before. So when you remove this lawn that was previously empty and polluting and taken for granted, really, and not really seen for what it is, you remove that and you plant food there, what happens? In some cases, it creates an entire community where there previously was none. For example, with the project in London, that was the case, I think. In some cases, it spawns this sort of dialogue or debate that is surprisingly heated or surprising. It's surprising to me how much attention there's been on the gardens just from the press, that there's an interest in talking about it. And I think that conversation in and of itself is the goal.